Hello and welcome to Introduction to Sociology. Today we're going to be talking about social structure and interaction in everyday life. So we're going to be talking about how society is socially constructed and constructed institutions to structure our lives. We're also going to be talking about groups and the importance of identifying with groups when it comes to socialization into a culture, but also when it comes to status because where you're located within specific groups determines your status. And if you compare where you're located in all the groups that you belong to, that's how you determine where you're located in the hierarchically stratified social system compared to other people. The first thing we're going to look at is social interaction. So again, what is social interaction? Social interaction is simply individuals interacting with each other. So, bumping into each other, having conversations, building together, working together, having, just hanging out. Anything that has to do with one person somehow interacting with another person, that's social interaction. But what you have to see is that society itself is not really a thing. What society is us. Society consists of individuals interacting, and the individuals interacting then get together, work together to build societies. Okay? So, for example, the education system doesn't exist in nature. The education system was constructed by individuals working together to form an institution. Now, institutions in society are not just material things like the education system, it's also values and ideologies and beliefs, such as the philosophy of the education system. So, an institution can be both material, physical, and non-material, like an idea. So, yes, the education system is an institution, but race is also an institution. Gender roles, the expectations that men should do one thing and women should do something else, these are institutionalized ideas. The idea is the institutions in society all structure our life. So whether it's an institution like the government or the economy or the education system, or just a belief or an attitude such as religion or gender roles or race, all of which structure our lives. Okay? So when we're in sociology, we take either a macro or a micro approach. Okay, so a macro approach to interaction and structure would be talking about big structures like the education system, and a more micro might be talking about the influence of the family. Albeit the family is a macro social structure that exists in society that structures all of our lives, the actual interaction of a family, the very different family types, of course, but parents or people that are raising kids and then different kids, some of them biological, some not, some adopted. The definition of family is very extensive. Okay, but the idea is we can look at society, look at institutions, and we can look at it from a macro perspective or a micro perspective, looking at big groups and how the big group works or how the small group works. So, when we go to apply all the theories throughout this class, remember that functionalism, the idea of this theory is this is how society works. All the institutions, the education system, the economy, the government, the family, media, they all interact with each other to structure society. Just like building the Greek Parthenon, for example, with the pillars. Each pillar of the Parthenon is an institution of society, like the education system, and all of that structures the whole. But the thing is, they also all affect each other. So if the economy goes down, that affects the family, for example. And when you're dealing with functionalism, you always want to ask, what's the purpose of this institution? Conflict theory looks at society again as groups competing with groups for precious resources. Okay? Where you belong in those groups dictates whether or not you have power. And so the whole idea of conflict theory is those in power are competing with those that don't have power. Hence the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. And again, symbolic interactionism is this idea that we socially construct society. We're the ones who made the education system. We're the ones who construct the society, the the ways that our lives are guided by social structures such as ideology, for example. Okay? So, when I first started teaching sociology, I did not fully recognize the importance of groups. But as time went on, it started to hit me. Okay, so groups, when you first start thinking about it, the first thing you want to think about it is how do groups socialize other people? How is identifying with the group associated with how you end up being, your overall behavior, for example. Because from our groups, this is when we first get socialized. So, as we talked about in the last chapter, the idea of being socialized into our culture, depending on the group that you belong to, dictates the type of culture that you get associated into. Okay? So, that's the association with culture and groups. Now, the other association with groups is where you belong in specific groups is associated with your overarching status, which is simply a measure of where you're located in the hierarchy. And so generally it's a math equation. So think about it like this. Your life chances, your ability to rise up the social class ladder is associated with your variables such as education, job, wealth, and power. So essentially, your education plus your job prestige plus your power, plus your wealth plus your power, that ends up determining your overarching life chances, access to material goods, access to healthcare, ability to rise up in the social class ladder. Okay, so ascribe status, that's what you're born with. And achieve status, that's what you've earned throughout life. But since the beginning of time, since we started to have a surplus and our societies became more formal, okay, and bureaucratic, we had this initial division of labor. And arguably, the initial division of labor was dividing society, stratifying society into groups based upon sex. So the initial division of labor in society was men and women. And what happened over time was once we divided into groups, those groups were then ranked into those who could have and who could not. Hence, men, for most of human history, were the only sex group that could have power, and everyone else, all women, were subjugated into the lower classes. Essentially, they were left powerless, unable to interact in society, unable to become doctors and lawyers, unable to vote, for example, until you had several movements of the civil rights in the United States. But the idea is, again, where you're located in these groups determines your power. So if you look at the groups of one group of sex, okay, which sex in that group has power? Males historically. When you look at the groups like race, which one historically had power? European descendants or non European descendants? If you look at sexual orientation, which group has essentially had power and which group was essentially stuck into the minority social classes, the lower classes? Heterosexism is this idea that, one way of life is normal and one is not. Hence, we subjugated people that didn't identify with the dominant group's culture, the status quo of monogamy and heterosexism, heterosexuality, for example. And so the overarching idea is yes, your education plus job plus wealth equals power. However, your ability to get access to an education, access to a good job, is then further subdivided into these groups that you belong to. Okay, so again, men historically had power. Whites historically had power. And then when it comes to social class, people with money tended to have the power. So those who have these double and triple layers of minority status tended to be subjugated into the lower social roles of society. And so when you think about the hierarchy of where people are ranked compared to other people, the only way to really historically get onto the top was to be European, to be a male, and so the top positions were denied to all non Europeans and all men. And that's why we've had to have the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, Asians undoing the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example. Because the way society was set up, based upon the group that you belong to and where you belong in that group, is associated with your ability to rise up the social class ladder. Okay? So the book talks a little bit about technology and social change. And again, this division of labor happened over time as society became more and more specialized. Okay. So historically, we migrated from a pastoral, just following the animals, to horticulture and agrarian society, and then into an industrial society of the 1700s and 1800s, and now into this post industrial society. And so a big question is what holds these groups together? And so Durkheim in functionalism talks about solidarity and talks about mechanical versus organic solidarity. And initially they're talking about mechanical solidarity as being these really close ties we had back when we lived in the small villages and small towns. And then organic solidarity is these ties that we have in modern times. And what's something that's really interesting is do you depend on more people now Or would you have depended on more people back in the day? And the way I like to think to answer this question is when you flip on a light switch, how many people does it take to make that light switch work? And in the end, it's thousands of people. It's an entire bureaucracy. Okay, so are we dependent on more people now than we used to be back in the past? Yes, but we might not have those same types of connections that we used to have in the past. Okay, the book discusses social roles. So again, where you're located in society, the social roles that you take, and then the expectations and behaviors attached to those status is highly influenced by the groups that you belong to. For example, the roles for men and the roles for women have been historically very different because of the division of labor and where you're located in a specific group. So if you get to identify as a male, the expectation and role for you historically was to become a breadwinner. And if you get to identify as a female, the role for you was to historically be a homemaker. And so, again, the groups that you belong to not only are associated with your status, but they're also associated with these cultural values. Because whatever group that you belong to, you end up getting socialized into that group. So yes, maybe everybody, in America gets socialized into the American way, but then that culture gets further subdivided into a male American way and a female American way. So males in America are socialized to be one way, and females are socialized to be another way. And then again, these social roles that are filled in society, that's often associated with all the other variables, social class, race, and sex, for example. There are specific social roles that were historically denied to anyone that wasn't male or European descent. Hence, politics, lawyers, doctors becoming president until we had Obama, for example. Okay, so again, the groups that you are associated with, the groups that you identify with, are associated with your ability to rise up the social class. They're associated with your overarching behavior because of the way you were socialized into the culture that matches the group that you identify with. And then we all learn the roles, the expectations and behaviors that we're supposed to engage in. Dramaturgy is a theory about how we all go out and perform these roles. When you think about dramaturgy, the idea is that we're all like actors on a stage and we're all putting on a presentation. We're engaging in impression management. You have your inner self, your backstage, and then your social self, your front stage. All of us are presenting this person that we are. However, the person that you present, again, is highly associated with the groups that you identify with and then how you were socialized into the culture of that group. So, depending on what kind of group you identify with, is associated with the way you talk, with the way you walk, for example. And you can kind of see this in little ways. And again, I've always put out this disclaimer in this class that a lot of the stuff we talk about can often be sensitive. But can you see subtle differences? Do all people of all races act and behave the same? And is that because of genetic differences, which it's not? Or is that because of cultural differences because of the groups that we belong to? Do men and women act exactly the same? Okay, and then how much of our differences are based upon our genetics, our biological sense of who we are, versus our culturally constructed sense of who we are and how our behavior is structured by society. For example, boys and girls cry the same amount, and then all of a sudden, about puberty, we start making fun of the boys for crying, but we encourage the girls to keep crying. So, why do boys not cry and girls do cry? Is that because of biology and genetics, or is that because our behavior was socially controlled by the norms of society that tell us how we're supposed to behave? Because the role of a man is not to cry, right? That's ridiculous. Absolutely. We should all cry. However, we're socialized that we shouldn't cry because we're socialized to take on the role of a man and to adopt the culture and attributes of a man and then put on the impression and engage in a performance as a man. Okay? Again, all of this comes down to overarching inequality. Okay, so the roles that we end up taking in life are not all of us have equal access to those roles. Again, historically only men and people that were of European descent in the United States could really access certain social roles. Hence the idea of inequality, that the groups that you belong to dictate whether or not you get a dominant social position or you end up in a subjugated social position. And again, all you have to do is study the culture of poverty for women to really understand how this works. And then you have to also understand how minorities were all restricted into the lower classes. And being stuck in the lower classes exposed all minorities to a culture of poverty, which increases crime rates and drug use and things like that. The book also talks about role conflict and role strain. Again, the idea of role conflict is, you know, when you are playing two different roles and they don't match up. For example, if I'm a dad, but I also have to work all the time, how can I possibly work all the time and be a dad? Or how can I be a dad all the time and possibly work? So sometimes I get caught between the two. And the stress that results from the role conflict, that's role strain. So if I'm getting stressed because I haven't seen my family in a long time because I'm out having to play the role of like worker guy, then I'm going to start experiencing role strain. Okay, and that's the way role strain and role conflict work. So again, socialization. The groups that you identify with is associated with the culture that you get socialized into. For example, there's if you're born into the south of the United States versus the north in the United States, will you be socialized into a slightly different culture, a slightly different way of talking? But again, just think about how somebody talks in the south, not everyone, versus how somebody talks in the north, not everyone. But there are subtle difference. There's a southern draw, a southern way of talking, like y'all ain't got no idea about how they talk down there in Nashville. But when I come up to Chicago, it's all nasally, I'm all nose, and I'm from Chicago. Because depending on the city I'm living, dictates the way I talk, okay? So again, your book breaks it down into the socialization into primary groups and secondary groups. Those primary groups, those are the ones that have the most importance to you, the ones that you have the most attachments to, such as your family group, your best friends, the overarching things about your culture. And then the secondary group might be people that you work with, acquaintances, things like that. So we're all influenced. We're all socialized by primary groups and secondary groups. We're socialized by our parents or the people that raise us, by our siblings, by our friends. We're socialized by the people at work. We're socialized by the education system. Again, those are the secondary groups. So all of us have been socialized into a culture, socialized into a way of life based upon the groups that we belong to since birth. If you were assigned at birth a status of being a female, you have been socialized into a female culture, a female way of life your entire life. And you might not necessarily have ever been socialized into a male way of life, which again has its own issues. So, again, whether or not gender roles should be upheld in society or not is a great debate. Should we be egalitarian toward gender roles? Should we be traditional? How does a socialization process influence women in modern times, for example? Again, how have we socialized women historically? We said, don't go to college, stay home, don't read a book. That's what we used to do with women. And then women were like, nope, not going to have that. We want to vote. So 100 years ago, women got to vote. And then 50 years ago, women got to become doctors and lawyers. And now in modern times, a woman can become a president. But again, we didn't historically socialize women to be like this. This is a modern trend. So you can see the social change and the socialization process happening all the time. Okay? So again, the idea is society is constructed by us. Okay, we're the ones who make society. The reality that you guys see, the language we use, the way of life, the institutions, our shops, our villages, our towns, our governments, we're the ones who made all of it. We made the education system. There's no biological basis for race. We made it up. We're the ones who decided that someone is black and someone is white, even though a white person and a black person are not genetically different. I mean, everyone's got a little bit of genetic differences, but we're not actually different. Okay? A white person has more genetically in common to an African than they do to any other white person. Again, look at it, guys. Look it up. Look up some of the biological genetic arguments for why we should deconstruct race because it's absolutely fascinating. But the idea is we're the ones who made up this way of life. If you don't like it, change it. If you love it, embrace it. Reproduce it from generation to generation. Okay? But again, who we are, our life experiences, this comes about through social interaction. We interact with other people, we learn what groups we belong to, then we adopt the way of life of that group. But that way of life of that group can cause major issues and result in inequality between groups where one person has more power than somebody else. Okay? Thank you so much, and you guys have a wonderful day. Please email with any questions.